In June 1934, news of the brutal double murder of a woman and her 15-year-old son in an affluent West Los Angeles neighborhood stunned the nation. The victims were found tied to their beds and hacked to death with an axe. Most shocking of all was the identity of the murderer, whose chilling confession shattered the myth of the idyllic American family and summoned a million nightmares. Come walk with me as we re-examine a tragedy that has been lost to history for more than 90 years. In Little Things, Confession of a Killer, the Louis Payne Murders. On Sunday morning, June 3, 1934, Dr. James Fisher knocked loudly on his neighbor's door. Then, for good measure, he urgently rang the doorbell. After waiting a few moments, he peered through the arched picture window but could not detect any movement within the house. Glancing at his wristwatch, he debated whether or not he should leave the matter alone and just go home. He had lived next door to the Payne family since they moved to the Los Angeles community of Westwood 9 months earlier. They were a friendly and decent family from St. Louis. The father was head of a utility company out there and was away on business a lot of the time. Mrs. Payne stayed at home with her 2 boys. One was grown and the other was a freshman at Beverly Hills High School. Dr. Fisher often observed the lady of the house and the boys in the neighborhood, but save for the lights that had been left on continuously for the past few days, there had been no signs of life in the house. He guessed that they had gone out of town suddenly and didn't tell anyone. All the same, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and wanting to be a good neighbor, he decided to have a look around. He walked to the side porch and knocked on the door, but still no answer. Observing that a nearby window was open, he lifted the screen and called out to Mrs. Payne or anyone else who might be inside. Again, he was met only with silence, but there was something else, the distinct odor of gas. Fearing a leak, he phoned the West Los Angeles police. 20 minutes later, LAPD radio officer Langdon rolled up to the house, and Dr. Fisher took him to the open window. The smell of gas was faint but distinct. The policeman climbed through the open window and entered the home via the laundry room. Announcing his presence, he stepped into the kitchen. It was empty. Checking the stove, he found that the gas was turned off and there was no sign of a leak. Officer Langdon moved into the narrow hallway and walked toward the rear of the house. The foul odor was much stronger here. At the end of the hall, he found an open bedroom door and peered inside the room. It was furnished with a dresser, a small desk, and a bed in the far corner, but no one was there. Clothing was piled carelessly on the floor, and on the bed was a copy of the June 1st edition of the Los Angeles Times. On the opposite side of the hall was another door shut tight with a towel jammed beneath it. When Officer Langdon pushed it open, a thick, fetid stench of decay rolled over him like a wave. Covering his face with a handkerchief, he saw a motionless form on the bed, shrouded in blankets. His eyes traveled the length of the bed and fixed on a pair of bare feet protruding from the tangled bedclothes, discolored, swollen, and unmistakably dead. Within an hour, the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department descended on the house in the 10,000 block of Holman Avenue. In all, there were 2 victims. They were 45-year-old Carrie Louise Payne and her 15-year-old son, Willis Robert Payne. Both victims had been bludgeoned to death with a small hatchet while they slept. The weapon was found under the bed of the deceased male. Only the male showed signs of defensive wounds. It was apparent by the state of the bodies that they had been dead for several days. Both had been tied to their beds with a thin household cord. The cord was wrapped around the male victim's legs and tied to the footboard. The woman had the cord looped tightly around her neck and secured to the headboard. Additionally, all of her clothes were stripped from her body. Several of her purses were strewn about the room as if someone had rifled through them looking for cash. It pointed to a possible robbery and assault. 2 other members of the family were missing. They were 49-year-old Lucius Payne and 21-year-old Louis. Dr. Fisher informed police that Mr. Payne had been away on business for several weeks. Only the eldest son was unaccounted for. The police conducted a door-to-door search for Louis, only to learn that the last day anyone had seen him in the neighborhood was Friday, June 1st. The date corresponded to the newspaper found in his room. Additionally, the June 2nd and 3rd papers were still on the doorstep. At this point, they didn't know if he was a victim or a suspect. The first order of business was to contact the father. The telegram that forever changed Lucius Payne's life reached him at the Mark Twain Hotel in downtown St. Louis. The hotel had been his residence for the last 6 weeks as he wrapped up his business with Commonwealth Utilities Corporation. On that Sunday, Lucius was a contented man because it seemed that every one of his 49 years of life was measured in degrees of good fortune and success. He was a skilled electrical engineer who rose through the ranks at various public utilities companies across the Midwest, rising from operator to managing director, then up to senior vice president. Despite the hardships of the Great Depression, the country's constant demand for energy allowed him to write his own ticket and provided amply for his wife and 2 sons. When the desk clerk handed him the Western Union envelope, he was certain it contained a message from his family. He was aware that his long absences from home since their move to California was difficult on them. He tried to explain that it was a necessary hardship as he had important work to conclude in St. Louis. Before stuffing the envelope in his pocket, Payne glanced at the name of the sender. Where he expected to read his wife's name, it said, Los Angeles Police Department. It froze him in his tracks as he wondered what on earth the LA police would want with him. He contemplated reading it right there, but after noticing the inquisitive stare from the desk clerk, he decided to wait until he got up to his room. And he was glad he did. The message was so unimaginable that he had to read it several times to comprehend its meaning. Its abruptness was matched only by its brevity. It regretfully informed him that his wife Carrie and youngest son Bob had been murdered. It gave no further details on what happened, but the second part of the message was the most baffling. It said that his eldest son Louis was missing and wanted for questioning in same. Wanted for questioning in same. He could not imagine what that meant. Assuming the message was true and Carrie and Bob had met with foul play, what would Louis possibly have to do with it? Then, like slamming the brakes on a car, his brain froze, as if blocking him from contemplating that question any further. No, 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 he repeated. This has to be an awful mistake. After pacing the floor, Payne decided to send a wire back home to get some answers and put the mystery to an end. When he reached the hotel lobby, his heart sank. The desk clerk pointed him out to a gaggle of reporters. He knew then that there was no mistake. Los Angeles was 1,800 miles away, and the press wouldn't unleash their news hounds on the wrong guy. As they gathered around him with their pencils, notepads, and questions, Payne could barely summon the will to stand upright, let alone comprehend the nightmare that just entered his life. Sergeant H.L. Grant of the Huntington Beach Police Department was on desk duty that Sunday night and didn't notice the young man slip into the station house until he heard approaching footsteps. His red, dark-ringed eyes were cast downward. He wore a tan topcoat over a brown pinstripe suit. He appeared tired and disheveled, as if he hadn't slept in days. When he reached the sergeant's desk, the young man looked up and in a hoarse, barely audible voice declared,
"My name is Louis Rude Payne, and I am wanted for murder in Los Angeles."
Louis Rude Payne was brought to LA's Old Central Police Station on 1st Street, where he waited nervously between 2 police officers. Since turning himself in, his actions alternated between smoothing his dark hair back over his head and sobbing convulsively. He frequently gripped his stomach, groaning in pain. Police, fearing he had poisoned himself, asked if he had taken anything. He said he didn't, but could not recall when he had last eaten. When he was searched by Huntington Beach police, they found on him a small caliber revolver, a toy police badge and whistle, and a few dollars in cash. They also found an unmailed letter and an unsent telegram addressed to his father in St. Louis. In both messages, he wrote about murdering his mother and brother. At 11 p.m. on June 3rd, Captain Hubert Wallace, the larger-than-life, cigar-chomping head of the LAPD Homicide Division, began interrogating Louis Payne. It was 30 years before Miranda, and Louis did not have legal representation. Louis was cooperative, but Wallace grew frustrated by his often confused and muddled responses, especially when pressed to give details about the double homicide and its motive. Of that, Louis claimed to not remember, or that he was in a daze or compelled by an urge greater than he. The questioning lasted several hours. By the next day, newspapers went to press with transcripts of the interview. What follows are the words of Louis Payne, edited into narrative form.
I have been trying to piece things together, but nothing fits anymore. I have been trying to tell myself that none of this has happened, that it was all a bad dream, and after a while I'll wake up and find my mother and brother just as they were. I want everybody to understand I did all this without really wanting to. It was just as though I was really crazy at the moment, and knew I was crazy, and I could not stop myself, and yet I don't think I'm insane. It was on Tuesday, I think. We didn't go anywhere that day, just stayed around the house. We had all been very blue and lonesome with Dad away. We talked a lot about him coming back soon. We went to bed early that night. In fact, I kissed Mother and Bobby goodnight, something I have been glad of. We were always very affectionate. After going to bed, I lay awake for a long time, fighting down some impulse, some mad urge. I think I went to sleep, and then I woke up and just lay there, restless. All the while there was that urge, some mad thing I can't even admit to myself. I tried to fight it down. You cannot realize what a struggle I went through trying to hold myself back so I wouldn't do this awful thing. I hope you don't ever dream about it. I tried to get a hold of myself, but I didn't seem to be able to. A lot of things seemed to stir up in me. Maybe it was an accumulation of a lot of minor resentments and disturbances. I just don't know. They might have piled up and all of a sudden broke loose. I got out of my bed, I don't know the time, but it was after midnight, and I walked into my mother's room. The moonlight was streaming in a window, and I could see her very plainly there, asleep. Then I walked in Bobby's room too. Maybe 2 or 3 times, I don't know for sure. On about my 3rd trip into Mother's room, I took a Boy Scout hatchet with me. I struck my mother on the head. After I hit her, she moved a little and groaned. Nothing intelligible, just sort of a gasp. I don't know how many times I hit her. I just seemed to keep on for a while. Why, I just don't know. I really did all this in a daze. I just can't seem to see all the details clear. I knew what I was doing, but it was like I couldn't help it, like someone stronger than me was urging me onto it. That really there were 2 parties to it, but physically only one. None of it seems very distinct now. I just seemed to be doing all this in odd moments, in sort of a mood. I kept fighting against myself. I don't know why I tied the cord around my mother's neck. I don't seem to remember even doing it. I think my mother was covered. I just hazily seem to remember pulling the blankets down. I sat on the edge of the bed looking at her, fascinated, just staring. I remember thinking the pajamas she had on looked ugly, so I took some small scissors and cut them off of her body. I don't know how long I sat there. After, I think I covered her up again. Then I went into my brother's room. He had not awakened at all. I think I hit him on the head. He groaned a little too. He put his hand up to his head after he was hit. I don't know what hand he raised. He just raised one of them and then lay still. I don't know how many times I hit him. I don't know whether he knew I was doing this to him or not. I left the 2 bedrooms. I didn't hear any sounds, and so I guessed they were gone away. I wished I could go too, somewhere, just be going away. The first thought was, I wished I had not done it. The second thought was that I wished I had some superhuman power of turning back time and restoring things the way they were. Words cannot describe the torture I have suffered. Every time I have thought of the good little times we used to have and the fun we had together, I don't know why I killed them. I don't know why, unless I guess it was just a lot of little things, or just that urge I was fighting and couldn't whip. When it was done, I felt dirty, like when your hands feel all sticky. So I took a shower and went to bed. That's when the real daze set in. I tried to think of everything to make myself snap out of it, and to fool myself into believing that it really was not so. I couldn't sleep, so I dressed and went out to the garage and took the car and went for a long drive. I don't know where, I just drove. I came back home, I don't remember whether it was dark or light. I went to sleep for a while. I got up sometime that day and just sort of hung around the house. I didn't eat anything. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid to look in the bedrooms. I took some long walks and tried to shake everything off. Everything was just a blur. I think I stayed in the house that night. I left home late Friday afternoon and haven't been back there since. I took some money off the dresser in the house, $15 or $20. I took my gun with me, a .25 caliber revolver. I didn't plan to do anything with it particularly. I just wandered around in sort of a daze. I knew it would all have to be straightened out some way or other. I didn't know just how. I didn't tell anybody what I had done. I just told God. I think it was on Saturday. I'm not sure. I went to a downtown hotel and wrote a letter to my father. In it, I tried to explain to him what had happened. I worked on the letter for hours, trying to fix it in such words so it would not shock him too much. I didn't want to hurt him with such terrible news. Then I wrote a telegram. I didn't send either one of them, though. I just kept them in my pocket. After I just wandered around and saw some picture shows. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat a little just to keep going. I drank some wine to forget, but I didn't forget, and it made me sick. I didn't sleep that night. I just walked. The next day, Sunday, I took a streetcar and kept on going. Then I saw my mother's picture in the paper and read the police were looking for me. That was when I turned myself in. I know that if my father had been here, none of this would have happened. I would have told him about the dizzy spells. He would have been able to help me, to stop me from doing this terrible thing. They tell me my father will be here tomorrow. Of course I want to see him. I want to see him badly, as a matter of fact. When I do, I want to point out to him how I was tricked by myself and how I really am overcome with grief. But I'm a little ashamed to face him. I don't know how I'm going to be able to explain everything. I don't know how I'll be able to make him understand, to see it from my viewpoint.
Captain Wallace was not impressed. He found Louis's answers to be contradictory. It seemed that whenever they asked him about crucial details, he claimed to have no memory of them. But when he was allowed to speak freely, his recollections were quite precise. He was also evasive. Whenever he was pressed, he made sudden emotional outbursts of remorse, only to become patronizing and arrogant a moment later. It was true that Louis's father would be there in a day or two, and Wallace was keenly aware that lawyers were coming with him. No doubt they would try an insanity plea to keep the boy out of the gallows. It meant that Wallace didn't have much time, but he had a plan. Louis Payne's journey home began on Monday morning as he boarded a TWA flight at St. Louis's Lambert Field. Still in a state of shock, he gave a brief statement to the press.
Louis is a normal boy. He just couldn't have done it. It goes entirely against his makeup. I have been informed that Louis has confessed to police, and if it is true, then he must have been entirely out of his mind. Something must have snapped.
Lucius's flight was a portent of what was waiting for him. The plane was buffeted by turbulence and had to be diverted around fierce thunderstorms. The delay nearly doubled the expected 16-hour flight time. It gave him a lot of time to think about how he was going to salvage what remained of his family. After a night of fitful sleep, Louis was roused early in his cell at the West Los Angeles police station. That Tuesday promised to be a big day, one where the police expected to get some clear answers. On Monday, he was visited by his uncle Roy Gregg and his second cousin Barbara Rude from Altadena. They too quizzed him on how he could have done what he did, only to get the same evasive answers he gave to police. With his father still hours away, detectives were about to try something bold to unlock the motive behind the brutal slayings. Shortly after 8 a.m., Louis Payne emerged from a police car at the home he had abandoned 4 days earlier. 3 burly police detectives escorted the pale young man to the front door. They observed that he faltered a bit as he entered the house, then moved about the rooms as if in a trance. They brought him to his brother Robert's room first. Everything was as its former occupant left it 1 week ago. The clothes he planned to wear the next day were still laid out on the chair next to his bed. The trumpet he played with the high school band was still in its case beneath the desk where he put it. An empty music stand stood nearby. Louis was asked to reenact what he had done to his brother, and he stiffly moved to the side of the bed and made a chopping motion with his hand while repeating what he had already told them. A photographer asked him if he could get a shot of him lying in the bed in the position he found his brother. Louis refused, saying he would do anything he wanted except that. He had held up so far, but when they brought him to his mother's room, he broke down into bitter sobs. The detective gently asked him to recount everything that happened here. Wiping away tears, Louis told him he didn't know what he did, that he had been in a daze and couldn't say for sure that he did anything. The police pressed on, reminding him of his earlier statement when he said that he was compelled by a lot of little things. They asked him to describe what those things were, and when did he finally make up his mind to kill his mother and brother. Louis apologized, saying he did not know, and that he never made up his mind to do anything. It was just a growing feeling that he was going to do something bad. At one point during the interview, he noticed his unkempt appearance and remarked that he didn't wish for his father to see him looking like that. The detectives, realizing the questioning was getting them nowhere, gave him permission to clean up and change clothes. They may have felt that allowing him this courtesy would build trust that might jog his memory. In a photo taken of Louis's bedroom, the brown suit he had worn for days can be seen folded up on the bed. Questioning continued for several fruitless hours, but the police decided to wrap up their outing when word came that Louis's father's plane had landed at Grand Central Air Terminal in Burbank. In all, the scheme had been a disappointment, as they were no nearer to discovering a motive than they were before. Photographers captured the moment they re-emerged from the house. It shows Louis freshly showered and shaved, hair coiffed, and wearing a blue suit. He appears helpless next to his frustrated captors. His ashen face seems haunted. For a week he had been alone, his true self trapped between the iron gears of his own fractured mind and the justice system. Now he was about to come face to face with his father, a reunion he both desired and dreaded in equal parts. He had no idea how his father would react when he saw him, and he was terrified. The TWA flight from St. Louis carrying Louis Payne arrived in LA at 11:45 a.m. on Tuesday, June 5th. Waiting to pick him up at the airport was his wife's sister Olive and her husband Roy. Lucius had no desire to rest after his long flight. He was heard to say,
"Take me to my son. I want to see him."
20 miles away, Louis was at the West LA police station going over his statement with detectives. He hardly noticed the office door open and didn't look up until he heard someone softly say his name. Like someone waking from a deep sleep, he blinked to clear his vision. Louis rose from his seat as he recognized the form standing in the doorway as his father. He tried to speak, but the only sound he managed to make was an agonized cry. His father started towards him and he fell back into his chair as if recoiling from reprimand. He needn't have feared. Lucius took him in his arms and held him not as the killer who battered the life out of his wife and youngest boy, but as an equal sufferer of an unimaginable tragedy. As they clung to one another sobbing, Louis cried out, "Why did this have to happen to us?" Lucius could only comfort his boy and tell him to be brave. "Dad, you should hate me," Louis said. "You should throw me away." The grieving father told him he would not abandon him and that he would do everything in his power to help him. At one point, Louis began to explain what happened, but Lucius stopped him.
"I don't want to hear about it, son,"
he said.
"Try not to think about it. There will be time for that later."
One newspaper reported that even the most hard-boiled detectives were seen wiping tears from their eyes over the heart-wrenching scene. The supervised visit lasted 2 hours, after which reporters were allowed in, and as they gathered around, Louis spoke up and asked them to go easy on his dad. Lucius made a short statement.
"My boy has been suffering from a kind of fever and has been for a long time. I can see now just how very sick he is. Maybe not physically, but mentally sick. He doesn't seem to know or understand what's happened or why."
A reporter asked him if he intended to stand by his son.
"Of course I will stand by him. He's all that I have left to me."
When it was over, Louis was in better spirits and even seemed relaxed. Before they parted, he promised his dad that he would eat something and get as much rest as he could. When his son was taken back to his cell, Lucius requested to be taken to the morgue to view Carrie and Robert's bodies. His in-laws were stunned. Roy had identified the victims on Sunday for police and saw firsthand how badly they'd been mutilated. Roy told his brother-in-law that it would be best to remember them as they were. Lucius did not have the strength to protest and instead asked to see the home he bought for his family 9 months ago. The car pulled to the curb in front of the pretty Spanish-style house, but no one got out. Lucius didn't move a muscle, he just looked, possibly recalling the last time his family were all here together. He may have even imagined the front door flying open and seeing all of them come running out to greet him, bringing his long nightmare to an end. The whole idea for moving his family to California in the first place was to make things better, but now those dreams were shattered. Louis had asked why this had to happen to them. Indeed, deep down Lucius knew. A more intuitive man might have even seen it coming. But before the thought could take hold, he told his brother-in-law that he'd seen enough for one day. On June 6, the LA County Coroner's Inquest convened at 10 a.m. at LA's Hall of Justice. Its purpose was not to assign guilt, but to determine the cause and circumstances surrounding the deaths of Carrie and Robert Payne. It was Louis's first public appearance, and due to the case's notoriety, the small hearing room was packed with spectators. Reporters noted that many of them were women and girls who came to see the young suspect. Supporting him at the hearing were his father and his cousin Charles Rude, who was hired as his attorney. The witnesses called to testify were members of law enforcement who entered the Payne house and those to whom Louis confessed. Dr. James Fisher, the good neighbor, also testified. Fisher told in dramatic fashion how he followed Officer Langdon into the home and made the gruesome discovery. Louis hid his face in his hands and wept as the doctor went into minute detail about the condition of the bodies. He described the utter savagery of the axe blows that nearly severed 2 fingers from Robert's left hand and that left blood, bone, and brain spattered on the wall and ceiling. All signs, the doctor said, that the boy had tried to fight off his brother's attack. Of Carrie Payne, he said her skull was so severely crushed that she was unrecognizable. Beyond the disfigurement, he described how she was tied to the bed using the word garroted. And in mentioning that she was found naked, he stopped short of suggesting something unthinkable by saying there were signs she was assaulted. The doctor's testimony caused gasps and murmurs among the spectators in the room, but for Louis it was more than he could take. He let out a cry that pierced the solemnity of the proceedings. His father tried to soothe him with words like, "Be strong, son. If I can bear it, so can you." But he couldn't bear it, and they were moved to an adjoining office where Louis collapsed on a couch. Above him hovered his father, who put aside his own heartbreak to comfort his child. With them was a journalist who was as cold and unfeeling as the camera he wielded to document the ruin of a family. When Louis regained his composure, he sat next to his father, and as he wiped away tears, he said, "This is such a dirty, rotten mess. Why did I do it?" The inquest was brief, and the verdict of the coroner's jury for both victims was the same. The deceased came to death on or about May 29th as the result of compound fractures of the skull inflicted with a small axe in the hands of Louis Rude Payne with homicidal intent. When it was over, Lucius Payne met privately with L.A. District Attorney Buron Fitz, who assured the grieving father that his office would not pursue criminal charges against his son until it was proven he was of sound mind. True to his word, Fitz appointed 2 psychiatrists to examine Louis. Later that evening, they announced their unanimous assessments that at the present time the young man was rational and coherent. However, neither could determine what his mental condition was at the time of the murders without a more comprehensive examination. Buron Fitz was satisfied that Louis Payne understood the nature and consequences of his crime and made the following statement. "The killings in this case are admitted. The only question that remains is the legal test whether young Payne knew right from wrong at the time the acts were committed." He sent the case to the grand jury that was scheduled to meet the following day. An indictment for murder was practically guaranteed, but it was an ordeal that Louis would have to face alone. His father would be attending to other important business. As predicted, the grand jury indicted Louis Payne with the murders of his mother and brother. The accused did not testify and only made a brief appearance at the end of the proceeding. It was noted that he was in a better frame of mind that day. The LA Times described him as stoic. His legal defense team had the addition of Judge Leonard Wilson, who read a brief statement from the boy's father.
I cannot reconcile the facts that have been presented to me on any other hypothesis than that my son has lost his reason. I intend to stay here and do all in my power not only to help my son, but to assist the authorities in bringing to light any facts which may have a bearing on this terrible tragedy. Naturally, I am a grief-stricken and broken man. I ask from the public only that judgment is withheld until the matter is presented to a court of justice.
Accordingly, Wilson announced that at the arraignment, Louis would plead not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity. While the grand jury was hearing testimony, Lucius was at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. The funeral service for his wife and youngest son was held at the Little Church of the Flowers. Built in 1918, it is inspired by a village church in Stoke Poges, Buckinghamshire, England. Lucius welcomed nearly 30 family members and close friends to the private funeral. Louis wanted to attend, but his father told him it wasn't a good idea for him to be there. In the end, the court stepped in and denied Louis's request. The doors of the church were closed when the service began. Outside, dozens of curiosity seekers waited, perhaps in the hope that the killer would make a last-minute appearance. Pastor Reynolds of the Westwood Community Church said in his eulogy that trying to know the reason for the tragedy was beyond the scope of human comprehension. The answer, he said, is known only by God, and that man must have faith in his divine wisdom. Following the service, Carrie and Robert were cremated and inurned within Forest Lawn's great mausoleum. With his painful task behind him, Lucius would focus all of his strength and energy on trying to save the life of his only remaining son.
Louis Rude Payne, who killed his mother and younger brother with an axe, has said he believes he is not insane, but was crazy in the moment and could not stop himself. He also confessed that his crime was committed under the influence of a lot of minor resentments and disturbances. No doubt it would be an excellent thing for society and a merciful thing for Louis Rude Payne if he were put speedily and permanently out of the way. The technical question as to his sanity need not be raised, though it's going to be. Young men who kill their mothers for minor resentments and disturbances hardly are good material out of which to make useful citizens. And while the sobbing sisters and psychiatrists are certain to leap upon this case with a profusion of tears and long words, the fact remains that Louis Rude Payne would be better off dead. The Sacramento Bee, June 8, 1934.
Louis Payne's dual plea of not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity meant his trial would have two phases. The first would determine his guilt or innocence, and if convicted, the second phase would determine whether he was legally sane at the time he committed the murders. The guilt phase of the trial began on July 16, 1934, and was presided over by Superior Court Judge Harry Sewell. Because of the interest surrounding the case, the jury of 5 men and 7 women were sequestered at a downtown LA hotel and barred from reading or talking about the case with anyone. The prosecution, headed by Deputy District Attorney Eugene Williams, said in his opening statement that Louis's remorse and amnesia were all a clever act, and that his horrific crime sprang from a malignant heart motivated by feelings of abandonment and resentment over perceived mistreatment from his mother and brother. Williams called an array of witnesses from law enforcement who were with Louis after his arrest. Detective Joseph Whitehead, who had been at Louis's side from the beginning, testified that the young man had a brilliant mind and was more intelligent than any other suspect he had encountered in his career. Whitehead said that when he asked Louis if he committed the murders, his reply was that it was a fairly established fact and an open and shut case. During the tour of the murder scene, Louis described how he had stood over his sleeping mother, brooding about an argument they had had earlier. Finally, he said that he was seized by a crazy animal passion and began hitting her with the axe. He said Louis also pointed out a small pair of manicure scissors on his mother's dresser and calmly demonstrated how he had used them to remove her pajamas. Williams then called Detective Lieutenant Sanderson, who testified that Louis told him the killings were motivated by the need to get revenge for the wrongs done to him by his mother and brother. He said his mother stopped paying attention to him and he felt like an outsider. One specific complaint was about his allowance of $1 per week. Louis allegedly said, "That's not a lot of money at all, is it?" Sanderson added that Louis said he began thinking of ways to kill them as early as 3 weeks before committing the crime. At one point he said he planned to use a bayonet, but at the last minute decided on the axe. The detective said that Louis had gathered all the money in the house and planned to escape to Mexico. When Prosecutor Williams recalled Detective Whitehead to the stand to read Louis Payne's confession letter to the jury, the defense objected, arguing that the letter was written while their client was mentally incompetent. Judge Sewell overruled the objection, stating the court was not yet addressing arguments regarding the defendant's sanity. The unmailed letter to his father was found in Louis's pocket after he surrendered. It contained a strained attempt to explain what he had done.
Dear Dad, please steel yourself for what I have to tell you. I don't know why I did what I have done, and I wish to God that I hadn't been able to do it. I really feel that something inside of me did it in spite of myself. Believe me, I have always loved you and Mother and Bob, and I do now and always will. My regret is punishing me more than anything else can. I must have been insane when I did this. I am going to inform the police. I hope how I feel will keep others from doing the same. I have always wanted to be good for you and Mother, and for you to be proud of me. But it seems that I often unwillingly do the wrong thing and hurt you. But when I hurt you, I hurt myself. I have killed Mother and Bob. I won't run away. Louis.
Late in the afternoon of July 19th, murmurs were heard in the courtroom when, in a surprise move, defense attorney Wilson called Louis Payne to the witness stand. His appearance had a legal technicality that restricted questions to focus solely on his state of mind when he allegedly confessed to the killings. Louis claimed to have no memory of confessing and only vaguely recalled talking to, quote, a lot of men who flashed lights in my face and asked lots of questions, unquote. Louis stated that he only went to the Huntington Beach police station to clear a few things up after seeing his mother's picture in the paper. On the last day of testimony, Louis's father was called to the witness stand. He described a normal, almost idyllic family life. He said there had been no warning signs of what was going to happen. The letters from his wife in the days leading up to the murders contained no mention of fear toward Louis or any indication of trouble at home. In their closing arguments, the prosecution shattered the notion of a happy family by recounting moment by moment and step by step the predatory movements of Louis Payne as he coldly and systematically hacked his mother and brother to death. They told the jury that the only fitting punishment for so heinous an act is the maximum penalty of death by hanging. The defense began their closing arguments with Charles Rude reminding the jurors that the confessions the defendant was purported to have made were not signed. He said the prosecution's claim that his client intended to flee to Mexico was absurd. He argued that if he intended to escape, why didn't he simply use the family car? Instead, he wandered around the city on foot for several days before hopping onto a streetcar bound for Huntington Beach. Rude also pointed out that in the letter to his father, Louis said that he wasn't going to run away. Last came defense attorney Leonard Wilson, who told jurors that if they could not find compassion for Louis, then at least have some for his father.
It must be self-evident that neither I, my colleague, nor the boy's father expect a verdict of not guilty in this case, but I do ask you to be merciful in your deliberations. There must be some way in the solution of this problem to consider this boy's father and to save him from more sorrow and disgrace than any man should be called upon to bear.
Following closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. It took them 4 hours and 4 ballots to reach a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of murder in the first degree. Their decision carried no recommendation for leniency. Louis and his father remained stoic as the verdict was announced. It wasn't until they were ushered into the prisoner's antechamber that Louis's composure shattered and his emotions spilled over into convulsive sobs. The decisive battle was set to unfold the following day in the same courtroom before the same judge and jury charged with determining the defendant's sanity and whether he would live or die. Yet an unprecedented courtroom drama loomed, threatening to unravel the entire case. On Thursday morning, July 26th, Louis Payne's trial shifted to the sanity phase that would decide his ultimate fate. As the trial's start time neared, a crowd overflowed into the hallway, vying for limited courtroom seats. Inside, the jury, prosecution, and defense attorneys were in place, ready for the proceedings to be called to order. As the 10 a.m. start time came and went, Judge Harry Sewell failed to appear. A search of his chambers found them empty. Inquiries were made at the Hall of Justice, but no one had seen or heard from him that morning. Phone calls to his home went unanswered, deepening the mystery. Finally, a substitute judge ordered a postponement of the trial until the following day while the search for Judge Sewell continued. Late that afternoon, Sewell's doctor informed the court that the judge was in a hotel battling severe bronchitis. Although the mystery of his whereabouts was solved, The incident sparked a war of judges that stole the spotlight from an already sensational murder case. Behind the scenes, Superior Court Judge Frank Collier had reason to believe there was more to Judge Sewell's illness than was being disclosed, and sought to remove him from the trial. When Collier learned that Sewell had only appeared briefly on Friday to postpone the trial until Monday, he was outraged. He rushed to the Hall of Justice to confront Sewell, but discovered he had already left the building. Collier sent a letter to Judge Sewell demanding that he resign from the case immediately, but it went unanswered. Sewell appeared in court on Monday stating he had no intention of resigning and asserted that Collier lacked the legal authority to demand his removal. Furthermore, Sewell accused him of putting politics above the law. The conflict escalated when Sewell missed his third court appearance on August 1st. Judge Collier then disclosed a March 1934 affidavit signed by Sewell, acknowledging that he was, quote, intemperate in the use of stimulants as to have lost the power of self-control, unquote. In it, he also expressed his desire to be treated for his addiction at a state hospital. With the backing of Judge Fletcher Bowron, head of the Superior Court's Criminal Division, Collier appointed Judge Reuben Schmidt to preside over Louis Payne's trial. Despite strong objections from Payne's attorneys, the court permitted the testimony to proceed. On August 2nd, Judge Sewell returned to the bench, furious over the attempt to oust him, and defiantly refused to relinquish his position. He acknowledged his problems with alcohol, but noted that it did not interfere with his work. In opening the court, he declared that due to the delays and interference caused by Judges Bowron, Collier, and Schmidt, he would entertain a motion for a mistrial. Judge Schmidt arrived moments later and ordered that all witnesses and jurors be taken to his courtroom in City Hall Tower. What followed would be described by one newspaper as, quote, the craziest session ever held in a Los Angeles courtroom, unquote. Amid the confusion, defense attorney Leonard Wilson formally requested a mistrial, and Judge Sewell granted the motion. As he retired to his chambers, he announced, quote, here I go, staggering off the bench, unquote. Pandemonium ensued as all sides tried to make sense of what was happening. Over the din of voices, Judge Bowron immediately vacated Sewell's order and instructed that all evidence and records in the case be seized and brought to Judge Schmidt's court. When word reached Sewell, he reemerged from his chambers and boldly countermanded Bowron's ruling and ordered the defendant to appear at Department 45 at 2 p.m. for case reassignment. Ironically, Judge Bowron oversaw Department 45 and was in charge of setting the judicial calendar. But by 2 o'clock, Louis Payne's sanity trial was already in progress in Judge Schmidt's court in City Hall. Like a passing storm, the battle of judges thundered on in courtrooms far away from the Payne trial. Once again, the raw weight of the hellish family tragedy took center stage. From the unfolding events emerged a clearer portrait of the troubled young man's past that cast long shadows, hinting at deeper truths that ended in murder. By the start of the sanity trial, Louis Payne had been examined by no fewer than 6 psychiatrists appointed by the court and the district attorney. However, there was no clear consensus on whether he was insane at the time of the murders. Doctors who deemed Louis insane diagnosed him with multiple mental health conditions, including personality disorders, emotional disorders, schizophrenia, and epilepsy. To substantiate the epilepsy diagnosis, they instructed Payne to stick out his tongue, revealing a scar purportedly caused by a seizure. Further evidence came from an LA County jail physician who observed Louis lying unresponsive and rigidly stretched out on his cot, seemingly experiencing an epileptic seizure. 3 other court-appointed psychiatrists dismissed the notion that Louis was insane as utter nonsense. After spending many hours with the patient, they unanimously agreed that he was feigning mental illness to avoid the gallows. One of the doctors was James Fisher, the good neighbor who discovered the bodies of Carrie and Robert Payne. The defense opened the sanity phase of his trial with witnesses who painted a picture of a budding psychotic. Louis Payne's early life in Missouri began normally. As a child, he was described as outgoing, friendly, and precocious. He excelled at school and expressed an interest in becoming an attorney or an engineer like his father. But the arrival of adolescence brought with it a marked change in his character. Gradually, he drew inward. He lost interest in his studies and going out with friends. His former high school principal noted that as a freshman, Louis's grades were average, but by his junior year, they were scarcely above the failure mark. He began skipping classes and was caught forging his parents' signatures on absence slips. He was known by other students as the odd boy who stared out windows. His principal described him as gloomy and under the impression he didn't have a friend in the world. In his senior year, Louis dropped out of school and was enrolled in the Missouri Military Academy. However, some of his character traits seemed incongruous with those of a socially avoidant young man. A neighbor of the Payne family who often gave Louis rides to school described him as a Rudolph Valentino type, noting his meticulous grooming and refined attire. Yet he added that engaging Louis in normal conversation was impossible. The staff at the diner where Louis spent hours alone drinking coffee and staring off into space nicknamed him the Patent Leather Kid for his polished fancy shoes. A newspaper reported that upon his surrender, he appeared as if he had stepped straight out of a fashion plate. It was as if he was dressing up to be noticed, but didn't want people to connect with him. The defense explored a possible physical reason for the peculiarities in Louis's behavior when his father testified about a head injury he suffered in a car accident, which left him unconscious for hours. As proof, Louis's body was again put on display to show the jurors a scar on his forehead. Although Louis's eccentric personality had struck others as odd, no one suspected anything gravely amiss until 2 years before the murders. During the trial, his cousin Barbara Rude recounted to the jury the tragedy which many believed was the cause of Louis's ultimate mental break. On the misty Saturday evening of March 19, 1932, 77-year-old Mary Collins was returning home after spending the day with relatives. After disembarking from her bus at Lindell Boulevard in St. Louis, she stepped into the busy intersection and was struck down by a car. Witnesses reported that the driver stopped, got out of his vehicle, looked at Miss Collins, then got back in his car and drove away. A motorist pursued the fleeing vehicle but lost it in heavy traffic. The hit-and-run driver was Louis Payne, then a 19-year-old Washington University student. The following day, accompanied by his father and an attorney, Louis surrendered to the police. He was charged with leaving the scene of an accident and fined $200 plus court costs. Additionally, his father paid a $1,500 settlement to the estate of Miss Collins. Louis's father believed the incident would only be a minor disruption in his son's life, but according to Barbara, it didn't turn out that way. She said Louis was never the same after the accident. He withdrew deeper into himself and had long periods of black moods. At times, he seemed totally detached from the world around him and had no memory of where he was or what he was doing. The most alarming issue was Louis's sudden fainting spells. Lucius recounted that once while his wife was discussing the accident with Louis, he suddenly cried out as if in pain before collapsing to the floor unconscious. Deeply worried for his son's well-being, Lucius relocated the family to California, hoping the fresh start would restore Louis's health. The benefits, however, were fleeting. In California, Louis enrolled in a business school, but neglected his studies and seldom attended classes. He once disappeared for a 24-hour period, only to turn up in San Bernardino, some 60 miles from home. While in an unconscious state, he had boarded a streetcar and ridden it to the end of the line before realizing what he had done. It was similar to his fateful ride to Huntington Beach. During this period, there was a shift in Louis's relationship with his mother. He felt their close and affectionate bond begin to deteriorate. She grew distant and cold and behaved as if she found him repulsive. Meanwhile, she lavished all her attention on Robert, who was a gentle and kind boy of 15, and who made friends easily and was becoming everything that Louis was not. It is likely that these perceptions were shaped more by Lewis's own distorted view of reality than by his mother's true feelings, but coupled with his father's long absence in May 1934, inflated his sense of rejection into despair. Barbara may have picked up on this the last time she saw Louis with his mother and brother a few days before the murders. She said that Louis appeared sickly and rubbed his head throughout their visit. Concerned, she asked him if anything was wrong, and he said he had a bad headache. His mother, however, seemed more dismissive than worried about her son's condition. Reflecting on that moment, Barbara said the memory had haunted her ever since. The last defense witness to take the stand was Louis Payne, who reasserted his belief that his son was insane. As evidence, he read to the court Louis's bizarre last will and testament, which was found in the boy's desk following the murders. In it, Louis expressed his wish for a military funeral and for his body to be buried in the Mississippi River. The prosecution presented its case last and set out to debunk Payne's insanity plea. An optometrist testified that Louis's tendency to stare into space was due to his eyes having difficulty in adjusting focus between near and far distances. In addition to the psychologist, the jury heard from members of law enforcement who stated that at no time during the interrogations did Louis come across as psychotic. They said that throughout his questioning he was consistently lucid and detailed in recounting his crime. The only time his memory appeared to fail was when he was asked about his motive. The prosecutor argued that Louis only began to, quote, act crazy, unquote, after his father returned to California, and that he was not psychotic but a psychopath, devoid of empathy and skilled at manipulation. He said that when Louis murdered his mother and brother, he knew exactly what he was doing and that it was wrong. He also believed that his intellect would allow him to succeed where killers like Leopold and Loeb had failed. The deputy DA theorized that by tying up the victims and leaving his mother's empty purses on the floor, Louis wanted to make his crimes look like a robbery gone bad. A young woman named Mary Johnson testified that she went on a date with Louis on the night after the murders. The DA said he might have been trying to use her to establish an alibi, but for unknown reasons he changed his mind. Louis Payne, he said, who had some knowledge of the law, used his father's money and lawyers to instead devise a more plausible scheme to feign insanity. The prosecutor closed his case, begging jurors not to allow a psychopathic, privileged young man to escape the justice he deserved. On August 15th, the jury began deliberations. By then, they had endured a month of confinement in stifling hotel rooms and a suffocatingly packed courtroom, battling boredom, isolation, and the relentless heat of a Los Angeles summer. In the criminal phase of the trial, it took them less than a day to reach a guilty verdict, but as deliberations in the sanity phase stretched into its second day, it became clear that the jury was struggling to reach a decision. Then, on the third day, they indicated that they had had enough by announcing they were hopelessly deadlocked. Their final vote was 9-3 in favor of insanity. After some delays due to defense motions, Louis Payne's retrial was rescheduled twice before ultimately occurring on January 7, 1935. It lasted 17 days and ended with a new jury unanimously deciding that Louis Payne was insane when he murdered his mother and brother with a hatchet. Spared from the hangman's noose, Payne was sentenced to the Mendocino State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he would undergo psychiatric evaluation for 1 year. If deemed mentally sound at the end of that period, there was a possibility he would go free. The decision sparked some controversy, but months after the brutal slayings, the public's attention had waned. On February 1st, only a brief item appeared in newspapers to report that Louis Payne had been transported to his new home 460 miles from Los Angeles. On that day, a press photographer captured the last known public images of Louis. He was sharply dressed in a tailored suit as he exchanged a warm farewell with his jailer. It's a moment that seems strangely poignant in that it could have been mistaken for a father seeing his son off to college. In another photograph, Louis appears bemused as he watches himself being shackled to his police escorts. He seems to be muttering something, perhaps about how it feels like a scene from a gangster movie. As the northbound train carrying Louis departed Los Angeles, the public spectacle that had gripped the nation quickly faded into shadow. But the epilogue to the story was not yet written, and Louis Rude Payne had one more life to claim. Nestled in the lap of the Ukiah Valley, in the shadows of California's coastal redwoods, stood Mendocino State Hospital. It was a sprawling fortress of brick and iron, erected in 1893 as a place of exile for the fractured souls discarded by society. It was a forlorn and wretched place. Only in our nightmares can we imagine what the long nights in Mendocino were like, when darkness crept along the peeling corridors like the shadow of death, and the sound of rats mingling with the cries of patients echoed down the halls like the last gasp of humanity. Nothing could have prepared Louis for this. When he arrived in February 1935, he joined a population of over 2,600 inmates, filling its aging wards built to house half that number. The facility was woefully understaffed, and the result was a life of strict rules, severe punishments, and neglect. If he believed he had a prayer of going free after a year, his dreams would soon be dashed. While Louis remained a guest of the state, events in the outside world moved quickly. In 1934, headlines of his murder case appeared in newspapers alongside those announcing the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany. A decade later, when Louis next made the papers, a world war was being fought to topple Hitler's Nazi regime. News of the war rarely penetrated the hospital's thick walls, but its effects were profoundly felt. By the early 1940s, the inmate population had swelled to over 3,000, and the reduction of staff who had gone off to fight made conditions even worse. Overcrowding bred chaos. Inmate-on-inmate violence and abuse were commonplace and oftentimes deadly. Patient escapes, or elopements as they were called, became a regular occurrence. In the mid-20th century, the treatment of mental illness was still in its infancy. Institutions like Mendocino State Hospital were not places of healing, but rather bastions of society's conformist demands, where interventions were devised as a means to pacify and restrain rather than to cure. Much of what passed for treatment is now considered barbaric. Patients with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or severe agitation were often subjected to hydrotherapy, which included prolonged immersion baths, wet sheet packs, or high-pressure sprays. These sessions could last for hours or even days and were intended as a form of restraint and discipline. Other practices masquerading as therapy included the administration of powerful sedatives, and in more severe cases, patients were given insulin to induce hypoglycemic comas. Many also underwent electroshock therapy, usually administered without the aid of muscle relaxants or anesthesia. By the late 1930s, a new procedure made its way into American mental institutions, one not administered with hypodermic needles, electrodes, or fire hoses, but with a drill. In 1936, the first prefrontal lobotomy was performed in the United States, and within a few years it had become a widely accepted practice. Advocates said it cut worry from the brain, while opponents argued that it stripped patients of their humanity. Patient records from this period remain sealed in the archives of the California Department of State Hospitals. Consequently, the specific treatments administered to Louis Payne are unknown. Based on his crime, he was almost certainly diagnosed with psychopathic personality, which was defined in the state's commitment manuals as a constitutional defect manifested by persistent antisocial behavior without remorse, insight, or capacity for reform. It meant that his stay was in essence a life sentence. It gives us a clue of the types of therapies he likely endured on a routine basis. He would have been housed in the hospital's wing for the criminally insane, where prolonged isolation and chemical restraints were as common as nightly head counts. And under California's strict eugenics program, he was possibly subjected to forced sterilization. There are many unknowns about Louis's later life. We can imagine that it must have been a lonely and confusing time for him. His devoted father, who had never left his side throughout the trials, returned to St. Louis shortly after they concluded. In 1936, he remarried and took up residence in Missouri. However, by 1944, Louis Payne had returned to California and was living in Sacramento, roughly 200 miles from Mendocino. There is no record of whether he visited his son, although it seems unlikely that he did not. If he did, we can only guess at what that reunion looked like, whether it was joyful or whether the passing years in the asylum had already scoured away the last fragments of Louis's personality, leaving only a hollow echo of the boy he once was. Louis Payne's stay abruptly ended on March 31st, 1944. His death was announced in the Oakland Tribune with the headline, "Madman Ends Life." The article gave very few details other than to say he hung himself after eluding guards. The Mendocino Coast Beacon went into a little more detail. It said that the 31-year-old secured a bedsheet and a towel. He tied one end of the sheet around his neck and the other to a stairwell railing, and used the towel to bind his arms before jumping. It leaves a troubling question. How did he manage to bind his own arms and climb over the railing by himself? If there was an investigation into his death, it was probably little more than a formality undertaken to protect hospital staff or perhaps to cover up cold-blooded murder. Either way, to the system, Louis was just another forgotten soul, who was one less burden to taxpayers. We do not know the location of Louis Payne's final resting place, but likely he was cremated and buried on the hospital grounds. After Mendocino State Hospital closed in 1972, all of the bodies were moved and reburied in mass graves in local cemeteries. In the end, being found insane did not save Louis's life. It only delayed for 9 years, 1 month, and 29 days his final plunge into the abyss. Behind a locked gate within Forest Lawn's stunning great mausoleum lies the columbarium of the Graces. Inside is a sea of marble niches bearing bronze plaques darkened by age. Among them are Carrie and Robert Payne. Time has all but erased their life's journey and the brutal ends that brought them to this place. They died in their sleep, unaware of who killed them. Although there is no consolation in that, we can hope, we can pray, that if there is a life after this one, and if the guilty can find redemption, may it be so that the Payne family are reunited, whole, healed, and at peace, forever. Thank you for watching until the end. So what do you think? Was Louis Payne a heartless killer, or was it insanity that drove him to commit his terrible acts? Please share what you think in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Until we walk again, my friends, stay well.